About 2-3 weeks ago, I asked you guys on my Instagram to send me one of your best works. Let's start with the positive. I like the contrast. The contrast is great. And that's pretty much all the good things I can say about this work. This part doesn't look right. I think you can separate the objects a little bit better by the best part of this tattoo is, I would say, the photo of it. Hey, my name is Troshin. I've been tattooing for the last 12 years. I traveled the world, done a bunch of tattoo conventions, got a lot of awards, and I also teach other artists how to tattoo. I do online courses, private mentorships, and I also do in-person seminars a couple times a year. And one of the parts of those seminars is tattoo critique, where I sit down with each one of the students and we discuss their work, I give some feedback, and we talk about how that person can improve their work. So I decided to do that for you for free. About 2-3 weeks ago, I asked you guys on my Instagram to send me one of your best works if you want to get my feedback. And in the first couple days, I got over 100 emails, which is kind of crazy, and I appreciate each one of you guys. I chose a few tattoos that I'm going to talk about, and if I didn't choose yours, use this email, send me your work again, and maybe next time, next month, you'll be lucky or unlucky, and I'll choose your work. Alright, the first work I'm going to talk about is this one. Let's start with the positive. I like the contrast. The contrast is great. You left a lot of negative space in the piece, and you get some solid black areas, which creates great contrast. I'm pretty sure this tattoo is gonna age well, and the contrast is gonna stay there, which is great. I like the composition overall. I like that you tried to add some movement by adding these flowing lines through the piece and adding the thorns. I do like that. And that's pretty much all the good things I can say about this work. Let's switch to the negative. The first negative is the composition. And I know I just said that composition is pretty good, but here is why it could be better. I don't like that all three objects are in the same exact line, and I think you could move them a little bit to the left and to the right. Let's say move the top flower a little bit to the side, either to the inner arm or to the outer arm, just to balance them out a little bit. That would be very nice for the continuation of this project. Another thing I don't like is it's a little bit messy in some parts. For example, the thorns in the middle, where the thorns overlap the bird, you added some additional details to the thorns, and I don't think it makes any sense because those details are just distracting from the main object, which is the bird, obviously. And I feel like if you just kept the thorns solid black, it would be better. I don't like how the thorns end here on top of the bird. I don't even understand what's going on here. Another thing I don't like is the edges of the bird. I feel like this edge around the head and around the wing that's further from us is a little bit too sharp, which makes the whole bird look much more flat. It doesn't have enough depth in the piece just because the edges are so sharp. So it looks like you just cut the bird with scissors and placed over the dark background. I feel like if you just soften some edges in some parts, especially around the wing, you could create this additional depth in the piece. I feel like this wing is a little bit messy, and because it sits in front of the bird and in front of the whole image, it probably should have a little bit more details and should look a little bit cleaner. I do like how you did the feathers on the bird. You kept enough negative space around, but you kept some details in the middle of the bird. And I feel like you could do the same thing with the wing. As for the flowers, they are nice, especially because you kept so much negative space. But I think that, again, we have some problem with the edges. Especially the edges like in the middle of the flowers. It almost looks like you outlined those things. And for a realistic piece, those outlines don't do anything good. They just simplify the whole thing, and the object doesn't look as real as it should. Also, I see that you tried to create some depth in the piece by making the petals of the flowers a little bit smoother in the back of the piece, but for some reason you did some of them smoother and some of them you kept pretty sharp, which doesn't make sense. Again, it just breaks the depth in the piece. I feel like if you kept the petals which are closest to us sharper, and you soften out all the edges that are further from us, that would help again with the depth in the piece. And just make the whole thing a little bit more realistic, I would say. Alright, next piece. As a huge Star Wars fan, I had to choose at least one Star Wars tattoo, and that's the one I chose. Positive things. I do like how you did the Vader. Obviously you put a lot of details in it, a lot of time spent on it. It looks pretty clean to me, so good job on that. And I kind of like overall composition that you used the Death Star in the bottom and you put the TIE Fighter in the back, but I feel like you could have done it much better if you just balanced those objects a little bit more. First of all, the TIE Fighter, I would do it much smaller, mostly because of the placement. You can't really see it in this photo, but this part around the elbow is actually not flat, and we have this bump on the muscle, and then we have the bones here. So at this angle in this photo, the wings look kind of normal, but I already know that if you step a little bit this way or that way, this wing is gonna break. The shape is gonna break. It's not gonna look straight just because of the shape of the arm. So you could fix that, but just by making the TIE Fighter a little bit smaller and maybe placing it slightly higher, so it just doesn't sit on this weird shape around the elbow. And the same thing about the Death Star. We have this bone here sticking out. And again, in this photo, for some reason, you cannot really see it. But I feel like you placed the Death Star around this bone, which means that this is the only angle from which the Death Star is going to look like a circle. Again, if you just move your arm, you will see that this bone will affect the shape of the Death Star. So I would try to move the Death Star a little bit either up on the arm or a little bit forward, if there is space for that. By this photo, I just can't really judge on what's on the other side of the arm. The placement is the first thing I would change. I also don't like this idea with the halo around the Death Star and the halo around Vader. I think you can separate the objects a little bit better by adjusting the contrast in the image, so you don't have to use those simple tricks as leaving so much negative space around the object. For example, if you kept much more open skin or negative space in the Death Star and kept the Vader's body a little bit darker and a little bit simplified, that would separate the objects and that would push Vader further away and Death Star closer to us. Create that additional depth in the piece. Same thing with the TIE Fighter. If you kept it a little bit smaller, put it a little bit further away, maybe simplify it a little bit, though it's not very complicated here either, you would probably add this additional three-dimensional effect in the piece instead of making this negative space halo around Vader. As for the Vader, it kind of looks a little bit flat to me, just because you used the same tones pretty much everywhere in the piece. You use solid black inks in the face and in the costume, and you use the same tone around the helmet, like on the edges of the helmet, which just creates the illusion of just completely flat object. What I would try to do is to decide which parts of this figure is the most important part, and it's obviously the face and then the hand, the glove. And I would try to put the most details in those parts, maybe a little bit of details on the chest of the Vader, and I would try to simplify everything else in the figure, just so when we look at it, our eyes and our brain knows right away where to look. Because when everything is detailed and when you use the same tone on everything, it's not just looking flat, it also looks less realistic. So you, as an artist, you are basically the director of this movie, and you have the ability to choose how the viewers are going to look and see this image. So you decide where to put details, which parts to put additional accents in, and additional contrast, and I feel like you should have done a little bit better job on that. Overall, I like the picture. I can see that you spent a lot of time, probably even 2 sessions on this piece, but we always learn, and I'm pretty sure that you can do your next piece much better than this one. Okay, the next one. Here I can see a dragon flowing around the arm, twisting and all that stuff. Positives. I like that you put a lot of details in the dragon, so you can actually spend some time looking at it, looking at all the textures, all the skin and stuff like that. I like that the dragon is not flat, it twists and it's a little bit three-dimensional. And I do like that you separated the background from the foreground just by using different tones. So you used solid black in the main object and you didn't use solid black anywhere in the background, which definitely helps to separate the main object from the background. That's about it from the positive things I can tell about this piece. Now the negative. And yes, I'm sorry, but there will be a lot of negative stuff to say. First of all, even though you twisted the dragon, I feel like you could add a little bit more depth to it just by simplifying some parts of the dragon. And you kind of did that in some areas, but I feel like it's not enough and you could have done a little bit better. So for example, parts that we want to bring our attention to should be more detailed and everything else should be simplified. So the parts of the dragon that are further away from us could lose a little bit of that texture, a little bit of those details, maybe just get some solid gray or black shading just to create this three-dimensional look for the dragon. Right now it's a little bit flat, even though you twisted it and moved around and all that stuff. Another negative thing I can see here is actually the background. Even though you didn't use any solid blacks on it, which is great, I feel like all those negative space lines going through the background just don't really make sense to me. I feel like you could have chosen some geometrical pattern for the background, and keeping the same contrast as you did here just made the background a little bit more interesting, because right now I guess you tried to add some flow and some movements to the background. It just, all those lines are a little bit chaotic and they just don't make any sense to me. I do like how you ended the piece on top of the shoulder here though. I feel like it's going to be very easy to continue this piece and add something on the chest, on the back, on the traps, so that's definitely a good thing. Another negative I can say is those flowers. I guess there is more of those flowers through the piece, even though I only see this angle. The flower is definitely simplified, and it should be because it sits behind the dragon, but it's not simplified enough. It's a little bit messy. I feel like you didn't spend enough time on the flower, and the fact that you outlined the middle part of the flower just makes it even more messy. It kinda argues with the dragon because everything else in the flower is so simplified and medium gray, and then the center of the flower has all those dark outlines which pulls that object forward to the dragon. Doesn't make much sense to me. I would try next time for a piece like that maybe to do a little bit more planning, maybe to first decide on the shape of the dragon and how it flows through the arm, and put that on the skin, and maybe outline it in light gray lines, and then for the rest of the piece, especially for the background, choose some cool patterns that would complement the shape of the dragon and would also look cool by itself. And the next one. Pretty cool piece. The best part of this tattoo is, I would say, the photo of it. I really like the depth in the photo. I do like those warm lights in the background in the picture. The tattoo itself, I feel like it could be much cleaner. I do like the composition, even though it's not very complicated, not very original. I would probably try to turn it a little bit more straight so it follows the shape of the arm a little bit more, instead of keeping it at the angle like this. The next thing is the lack of contrast in the piece. I like that you kept the background a little bit more simple. You didn't make it too contrasty, but at the same time you didn't make the main object contrasty enough. So I would love to see a little bit more negative space in the face, on those pieces of jewelry, on the head piece, and in this ear that is closer to us. I would definitely try to simplify the ear that's further away from us and make this ear a little bit more detailed, again to create this additional depth in the piece. You put some amount of details in the headpiece. I feel like you could do a little bit better just by spending more time on the piece so the whole thing looks cleaner. Another thing I don't like about it is the outline you added around the head. I think it just makes the whole piece a little bit more flat because of that outline. So it would make sense to outline some parts of the image, maybe these parts in the middle that are closer to us. Maybe make the eye a little bit sharper so it sticks out as the center of the composition. But the rest of the head I would try to simplify a little bit more. And also I can see that you did most of the piece with a round liner, but at the same time all the dark parts, all these solid black areas are done with the mags, and they look much more dirty compared to the round liner part. So if you don't feel confident enough using round liner for solid black areas, I would say just go over those areas with the round liner first, and then slightly darken them up with the mag on top of the round liner. Just be careful to not overwork the skin too much so it heals nicely. In this example, I think you did a little bit too much with the mags, and the mags part looks much softer, and then the textured round liner parts look much more detailed and much cleaner too. Except for this part of the background around the moon. This part could definitely be way cleaner. I can see the direction of shading around the moon, and the shading is just uneven and not as clean as I would love to see. Alright, next one. That's a pretty cool front piece. Positive. I love the cross. the cross looks very detailed and very three-dimensional. I can see a few layers inside the cross, which is really cool. So I spent a few minutes just looking at the cross and noticing some cool details in it. Everything else is not very good. I don't like the placement of those statues. For the bottom ones, I would move them a little bit lower so they sit before the chest muscle starts, so it doesn't break the shape of the statues. And for the sculptures that are sitting on the chest, I would move them a little bit higher, further away from the cross, and make probably all of them slightly larger, so the skulls are large enough to put some nice details into them. Because all these clothes, like all this fabric around it, is nice if you have done it cleaner, but since you haven't, it just looks a little bit messy, and the main objects, which is the faces of those statues, just don't have enough space to put some details into. So yeah, I would just change the composition a little bit, move them away from the cross, move them away from the muscles, make them larger, and then probably just spend a little bit more time on the sculptures, just so the whole picture looks cleaner. Because the cross, to be honest, looks much better and much more detailed than the rest of the piece. Tattoo number 6. I can see that you are very inspired by another artist, Alex Sorsa, and I can see that you used a lot of tricks that Alex uses in his work. And it's cool to get some inspiration from other artists, and I've done that in the first few years of my career too. It's cool when you learn new tricks. It's just, I feel like it's not very cool when it's so obvious that you pretty much copy somebody's style instead of creating your own style. Overall, the work is good. It's pretty clean. I can see a lot of small details, a lot of little things in the glove, in the face mask. The face is pretty clean too. The hand looks nice. The neck and the chest don't look very good. I think you broke the shape of these parts a little bit, or I just don't understand what's going on in the photo, but this part doesn't look right. Also, I am not sure what you are planning to do around the head, because since you've done the edges of the head and the edges of the arm this dark, then to separate it from the background, you would have to keep the background much lighter. And because the whole edge is dark, I am not sure how you can make this look right in the future. As for the flowers and some additional things in the image, again, as always, I would try to keep a little bit more negative space in them, just because since you don't have the background behind the flowers, all the shading you do inside of those flowers just means that you will have to make the background much darker to make the flower pop. So I would try to figure out the background first before you do the shading in the flowers. And similar thing with the glove and the flowers or the leaves behind the glove. Right now, because of the redness, it looks cool, but I can see already that when the whole thing heals, the tone inside of the glove is going to be very similar to the tone inside of those leaves in the middle, which means there will be not too much separation between those objects. It's just going to look a little bit more flat. My main thing is the contrast, a lack of negative space in some parts of this image, anatomy mistakes on the neck and on the chest here. And I would just recommend you to find your own style and your own ways to make your work a little bit more unique instead of trying to just copy what somebody else does. Next one. That's a nice skull, pretty detailed, pretty clean, though the whole thing is done with mags, which I don't like as much as round liners, but that's not fair. You can do a great job with the max too. The first negative thing I'm gonna say is just the overall composition of this piece. It looks fine in this photo. If this person would come to me to get some other stuff done around this piece, I would have troubles just because it looks so self-sufficient. It kind of doesn't need anything around it. And when you start adding things around it, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. Even though you kept this bottom part of the arm pretty open, so this is nice for the layout for the next piece. But this frame, especially on the side of the arm, I'm not sure about that. Also, I don't like the rope in the cross. It could have gone a little bit over the skull to create the depth, and this part could go a little bit more behind the skull just to make it a little bit more interesting. Right now it's just weird positioning of the rope in the piece. As for the frame of the window and the skull and interaction between those two objects, I would do it slightly different, just because if you think about it, the teeth and the nose and the eye of the skull are in the same layer as the frame of the window. So I would try to keep the window as sharp and detailed as those parts, just so we don't push the window to the back of the piece, because it actually sits in the front of the piece. The next thing is the using of white inks in this piece. I can see that you used whites in the most important parts of the piece, which is great, around the teeth, around the nose, and around the eye. What I don't like about your using of white inks is that you put them in other parts of the image. For example, around the skull here and around the chin, and in his right eye hole, which sits a little bit further from us. So just by doing that, you kind of destroy the purpose of putting white in this piece. I feel like if you did the white only in the parts that should stick out and be closer to us, then you should avoid putting the white in those areas. At the same time, I would put a little bit of white in the frame of the window, just again because it sits in the same layer as the nose and teeth and eyes and the cross too. Tattoo number 8. Okay, that's a cool piece overall. I can see that you get a lot of inspiration from Oscar Akermo and other artists doing similar style. I like that you kept the flow through the arm and you followed the muscles and you followed the shape of the arm. So it's a nice placement of those objects. I think you could have done the whole piece a little bit cleaner, because when it's so minimalistic, my eyes personally just stick to all the imperfections. So for example, these lines around the elbow are not very clean, and since there is nothing behind those lines or around those lines, I just see it right away that those lines could be much cleaner. I like that you kept some depth and some three-dimensional look in the piece by using different contrast for different parts. I would say my main concern is just the cleanliness of the piece. How clean are your lines, how accurate they are, and also you did the eye on the wrist pretty nicely and detailed, and the tree looks cool, but the bird is very simple. The bird is very two-dimensional, not detailed at all. I feel like you could have spent a little bit more time on the bird and make it look much more realistic, because in this style it's very important to keep the real objects as realistic as possible and keep the lines and all the additional elements as clean as possible. That will help to separate visually those things, while at the same time making the whole piece look better. Piece number 9. That's a cool back piece. I like the contrast. I like that you have a good amount of negative space in the piece, and you put some cool details in the piece. like those filigree in the eye holes of the skull and in the nose. That's pretty cool. As for the negative, the whole piece is done very, very quickly. As I can see, I'm not sure how many sessions you spent on this piece, maybe 4 or 5 or so, I would say. It just looks a little bit dirty to me, a little bit messy, not very clean. I can see the direction of shading everywhere. I can see that you're using the same tones in pretty much each part of the piece. You're using solid blacks in the middle of the piece, you're using it in the background, you're using it for the outlines of this filigree on the sides. You even outline some parts of the lion and the skull. I feel like if you just spent twice more time on this piece, it would be way more clean. And if you planned the tones you're using in the piece a little bit ahead of time, you could have created a much more realistic and three-dimensional piece. Right now it's a little bit too flat because the same tones are used here and there, and you outlined a little bit too much stuff in the piece. I understand the reason why you would outline the filigree on the sides to separate them from the main object, but when you outline every little thing in the object itself, like every little piece of hairs, every tooth, and every little detail, it just makes the whole image looks way more flat than it's supposed to. And the last piece for today, number 10. That's a really cool piece. I like it. I guess it sits on the back of the lower leg. What I like is the whole idea. I'm not sure if it's your idea or you just took a picture from internet. Either way, it's a cool design. I like it. What I don't like, first of all, a photo. It's very obvious that you just cut the leg from the background and it kind of looks cheap. I would just recommend you to find a black or gray or whatever else background and just take pictures in front of that background. It's gonna look much better and just improve the whole perception of your tattoo when you take pictures nicely. I would also use a polarizer here for sure, just to create some additional contrast in the photo. As for the tattoo itself, as always, I would love to see more negative space, even though you kept some negative space in the face. I would try to keep a little bit more negative space to help with the contrast. And also I would try to plan before I start tattooing where which tone will go. For example, if you use solid black in the middle of the face, I would probably avoid using it on the sides of the image, in the hairs, in the water, just because it makes the whole image look much more flat. When you are planning a piece like that, I would try to decide, like here, for example, we have a portrait. And in this portrait, we want the eyes of the person looking at the tattoo to concentrate, first of all, on the eyes and glasses, and second of all, probably on the lips. So I would try to have the most details and the contrast in those parts of the piece and simplify everything else a little bit and use the right tones in the right parts of the image. That will make the piece way more realistic, way more three-dimensional, and it will also help with the longevity of the piece, because when you use so much medium and dark gray tones, then a few years later it's just gonna look like gray square with some facial features in the middle of it. If you just kept a little bit more contrast in the piece, you would probably do a better job with this. And that's all I have for today. Thanks for watching. If I didn't choose your work, send it to this email and maybe I'll choose it next time. And if you want to learn tattooing from me, then check the link in the description, join the community, and I will let you know when something new and exciting happens. Thank you.